Now, while many of you are dialing in from across Canada and sometimes places beyond the borders, I'm speaking to you from Toronto. And I'd like to begin today's session by acknowledging the land where we live and work and recognizing our responsibilities and relationships where we are. As we are meeting and connecting virtually, I encourage you to acknowledge the place you occupy. I acknowledge that I am, and Maitri is, on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and also covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which was an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the lands and resources around the Great Lakes. So today's session, there are many compelling reasons why charities and nonprofit organizations might seek to collaborate in different ways, to have greater impact, for broader reach, to create efficiencies, or perhaps when they're driven by funder interests. But as great as partnership and collaboration may sound, they can also be tricky to establish, nurture, assess, and know when and how to end. In today's session, we're really pleased to have Teresa Marques, who will present her 5 good ideas on how to navigate effective partnership development within the nonprofit and charitable space. Teresa Marques is an established senior executive and educator in the nonprofit sector. She's currently the president and CEO of the Rideau Hall Foundation, an independent national charity with a vision for a better Canada. The foundation works to address key challenges facing the country in the areas of learning, equity, creating a culture of innovation, leadership development, and by strengthening Canada's culture of giving and volunteerism. For her full bio, plus her ideas and resources, please download the handout in the chat. It is now my pleasure to welcome Teresa. Welcome.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It is so great to be with you today. I'm joining you from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And I'm here today to talk about my own experience in developing strong partnerships across the charitable and nonprofit landscape. I'm especially pleased to be talking with the Maitri community of incredible social sector leaders from all parts of the country. When I was looking at sort of the who's who in the room and preparing for this talk, a few things became pretty clear to me. First of all, this issue around collaboration and partnership building is something that people care about and that I think we're all kind of grappling with. I think it's made clear by the turnout, but it's also made clear just through anecdotal conversations that I've been having kind of at a micro level, one-on-one with sector leaders, particularly over the course of the pandemic. I think in many ways, the pandemic has kind of made stark our own sort of vulnerability and as well as our mutual sort of interdependence as a people, as a sector, and as a country. And I think that's part of what might be driving the interest in this conversation today. Secondly, I think we're all looking for new solutions to increasingly complex challenges. And I think that there's a realization that long-term social change cannot be driven by any one of us alone. Old ways of working aren't going to deliver the solutions that Canada needs. It's going to take new kinds of collaboration and partnership to deliver change and change that's lasting. Now, I think that, partnership sounds good and it sounds benign and it sort of sounds easy. But as we've learned at the Rideau Hall Foundation, and as I've learned, it can be really hard to know kind of where to begin, how to operate in partnership, how to be a good partner, and when to end. And I'm thinking specifically sort of primarily about partnership and collaboration across the charitable sector and across nonprofits, less about sort of between sectors, if you will, but we'll talk more about that kind of as we go. Thirdly, I think this audience represents a really significant kind of diversity within the charitable and nonprofit sector, which is wonderful. You have so much more to share on this topic, and I'd love to try to surface your own experiences, lessons learned, and best practices. I'm not sort of holding myself out as an expert on partnership development, but rather as kind of a work in progress and someone who is learning by doing. The last sort of observation before I kind of get into the substance of today is that as I was preparing for this talk, I realized that it's a really personal conversation. It's about how well we sort of play with others, and it can be mirrored in how we act in our personal lives, in our families, in our communities, and at work. And I admit, I felt a degree of kind of vulnerability, even in preparing for this talk, because it's not objective. It's not about any one of the findings of a report that we had, that we'd taken on, or work that we had done, or a new program that we'd launched. So I felt sort of vulnerable. But I actually think that being open and vulnerable as a starting point is a really good way to learn, starting with humility and openness as to what might be possible. So even though I have 5, what I hope are good points, I'm going to sort of add in a 6th, sort of a sneak attack on vulnerability, because I do think that being vulnerable is a really good place to begin to build real relationships. And that's what good partnerships are all about. So I'd like to start by telling you a little bit more about the Rideau Hall Foundation, because I think it's pertinent in many ways to the conversation today and to the 5 ideas that I'd like to share. So as Elizabeth mentioned, we're a national charity based in Ottawa, and we're focused on building a better Canada for all Canadians to succeed and to thrive to their fullest potential. We work to amplify those values that serve to unite us as a country instead of divide us. All of our work is anchored along 4 kind of areas of focus around innovation in the country, widening the circle of giving and volunteering, leadership development and the leadership of our public institutions, and learning equity. So a broad sort of scope of interest, but it's a broad country with complex needs to be tackled. Everything that we do is rooted in collaboration, which again has been an amazing sort of starting point to help us engage in some very interesting and I think meaningful work, but nothing kind of looks like anything else at the Rideau Hall Foundation. So across those 4 kind of areas of focus, we operate about 12 to 15 particular projects, and each project will have its own set of partners, its own sort of metrics, its own outcomes, and its own kind of modus operandi. When I think about sort of the toolkit in terms of how we work in partnership, very simply, there seems to be sort of 4 ways that we kind of work. The first way of working, the first way of kind of collaborating has to do with our convening role. So traditionally, the Office of the Governor General, which is independent from the Rideau Hall Foundation, has that as sort of a primary responsibility and role to convene Canadians around issues of importance to the country. So we've taken on more of that role as well, convening Canadians and organizations across sectors on key issues. We also work on catalyzing new initiatives. So once the conversation has happened, then what? We can work to bring together the right people, ideas, some resourcing, and some infrastructure to give a project a home for a period of time, to catalyze it, and then to set it kind of on its way. The third way in which we work is to bring funding to the table. So we're not sort of a formal grant-making foundation, but we do have the ability to bring financial resources to the table. Sometimes that means a direct grant or contribution. Sometimes it means that we'll actually go out and fundraise for another project, an organization that we're working with. And the last way of working is by playing that role of kind of administrator or operating partner, where folks on our team serve as that sort of operational support system to a project that might not have the capacity to kind of do it alone. So this flexibility and kind of range of ways of working is both a blessing and a curse, again, because nothing looks like anything else. It allows you to be really focused on kind of the outcome that you want to see achieved, and to bring the right tools and resources to the table without kind of presuming what those tools and resources are going to be at the very outset. So with every partnership that we engage in, our starting point is really to say, how can we help? And the answer to that question will look a bit different each time, but it is very liberating. And I think I've experienced that it's a very open question that can set the table for very sort of effective partnership. So that's probably enough of a preamble. I'm on sort of who we are and kind of what we're all about. And I'm happy to talk in more detail about kind of anything RHF related a bit later on or in follow-up. But I'll turn now to kind of what I hope are 5 good ideas or useful ideas that folks around this table can relate to and hopefully take away. So the first kind of good idea is that I think form needs to follow function. Now, partnership development across our sector can take many forms and be driven by many kinds of motivations. I spoke about 4 of the ways in which the Rideau Hall Foundation partners with organizations across the sector. That is not an exhaustive list. I'm sure that across this proverbial room, there'll be lots of other different kinds of ways of working. But the point of this kind of idea is that before you jump to a conclusion about the right form of partnership it's really valuable to start with a conversation about your values and on what's really important to you and to your partner organization. I had the good fortune of spending some time last week with Zita Cobb, social entrepreneur extraordinaire from Newfoundland and one of the founding board members of the Rideau Hall Foundation. And what she really drove home for me is that the most important thing is to keep the most important thing the most important thing. So if you say that 3 times fast, it'll begin to sort of sink in. But really, it's about figuring out what your internal goals are, as well as your shared goals, what the table stakes are for each party, so for each of the partners, what your respective sort of strengths as well as challenges are, and then design the partnership model that best suits your particular situation. I think it's really important, again, not to make assumptions about your partner, what their motivations are for partnership, what their capabilities are. And you're going to hear many sort of different iterations of don't assume throughout the next little while. I think the big takeaway on this point or this idea is, again, not to assume going in that you know what the final shape of the partnership will be. Give yourselves the time and space to create at the outset and to have those critical conversations about what is the most important thing that needs to keep being the most important thing. I'd like to give just kind of one example to sort of illustrate this from the RHF's perspective. Early on in the pandemic, we were approached by an organization called it's a mouthful, the Foundations for the Studies and Processes of Government. And FSPG ran a program for about 45 years called the Forum for Young Canadians. I'll just call it Forum because it's much easier. So Forum is a program that helped young people, young Canadians, learn about the functioning of our democracy, bringing young people to Ottawa to have an experience where they learn from each other and to learn about how our public institutions work. And it really sort of tried to engender the sense of civic engagement that would last a lifetime. So the pandemic was very challenging for this organization, and they were seeking more permanent sort of operational sustainability. At the same time, we at the Rideau Hall Foundation were looking to get behind programs and to back initiatives that were doing exactly what Forum was seeking to do, to grow and to nurture young leaders who care deeply about the country and who know how to engage with our public institutions. So fast forwarding a little bit, we did have heavy conversations around what their values were, what they were hoping to see emerge from a potential collaboration. And from that, we developed a partnership model that saw Forum move into the Rideau Hall Foundation. The program was essentially kind of gifted to the RHF to take it forward in such a way that continued to prioritize the ongoing involvement of key leaders from that organization in the form of an advisory committee that continued to prioritize the values of Forum, that prioritized the brand as well, and just the incredible sort of value behind the brand itself, which was felt to be very important by the board and which we believed to be important too. So all these factors kind of helped us build a partnership model that ensured continuity and a really smooth transition of this program that's now able to have a much longer term, more permanent future under the umbrella of the Rideau Hall Foundation. But I wouldn't have told you kind of at the outset that we would have landed on this sort of merger when we started talking. It was really only through having those important conversations and frank conversations about what we're looking to achieve and what we valued in order to do so. From the RHF's perspective, I think understanding what FSPG, the other organization, valued allowed us to keep their priorities top of mind when we were making decisions about how to move forward. And that built trust. I know I'm fast forwarding to the 5th point on trust, but it did build trust, and it built a really strong kind of basis of understanding, at which point everything else moved so much more quickly. So that's the first point, really on just, not assuming that you not rushing to the chase on kind of what form the partnership should take. Take the time to really build the relationship and understand the motivations. The second kind of good idea that I'd like to speak to is around being open to kind of unconventional arrangements or partners. And this point is really about being, again, open to experimentation and particularly to different viewpoints. I think many of us have encountered limitations to collaboration within the charitable and nonprofit sector about how organizations can work together, particularly when there's a flow of funding involved. This is not news to anyone in this room, but registered charities are limited in how they can direct funds to organizations that are not qualified donees. Now that's beginning to change. I think Bill 216 and its amendments to the charitable sector to legislation will hopefully make it easier for groups in our sector to collaborate effectively and efficiently and to direct resources wherever the resources need to go. But in the meantime, we've been able to develop ways of supporting organizations that are not qualified donees by being a bit creative. It took some time to sort through, and it was new to us, but I think it was time really well spent, and we now have a pretty effective model in place to be able to do more of that, again, by being a bit creative. One of our signature programs is called Catapult Canada, and it focuses on eliminating barriers to learning for young people across the country. Through the most recent round of kind of programming support, we were able to provide supports to both qualified donees as well as non-qualified donees. And I'm hoping this is something that we can talk more about and share our experience towards. We also found other ways of working with non-qualified donees, including, for instance, supporting the legal fees of a partner organization that was seeking charitable status, and finding other ways to really help to build the capacity and infrastructure of the organizations we're working with. But maybe those partnerships didn't look exactly like traditional sort of grants. There are many other networked organizations on this call and across the country who are doing great work in this space. And I think it's really important that we're learning from one another so that we can move forward more quickly as a country and as a sector. I think it's really important in this sort of vein to seek out complementarity as opposed to similarity. Now, I'll give you one example that's relevant to the Rideau Hall Foundation's experience. And it's about sort of our origin story. So the Community Foundations of Canada, a separate organization, incubated the Rideau Hall Foundation as it was kind of born. That makes it sound like an alien, but basically CFC took it upon themselves as an in-kind contribution to build up the RHF as a separate independent organization. So CFC has a different mission, a different vision than the Rideau Hall Foundation, a different way of working, a different type of culture. And yet, by giving the RHF an early home at a critical time, it helped us to grow and to reach kind of the position that we are today. That relationship of the RHF being incubated by CFC was never intended to be a permanent kind of ongoing relationship, but it allowed the infrastructure to build while we were able to build up our own kind of resource base of operations. So the Rideau Hall Foundation is now in the position of providing that kind of similar support, in-kind support to other organizations. So for instance, we provide sort of the back-end administrative capacity for another project, another organization called the Arctic Inspiration Prize, as it's working to kind of build up its own infrastructure and capacity kind of across the North. So different ways of working, but again, there aren't that many examples of across the country, but I think those examples need to be shared so that more of us within the sector can kind of figure out new ways of kind of approaching collaboration. I think it's also really important to assume, to not assume that things have to be done the way they've been done before, either by your organization or by others. One of the resources that I pointed to in my handout is a book by Adam Kahane called Collaborating with the Enemy. And it sounds like super negative, but it's really not. It is, I found it to be a really, really interesting read that was more about, how you think about your own values, how you articulate those values, and how you approach different ways of coming to consensus. So it really sets aside sort of a hierarchical kind of top-down approach to decision-making in favor of a shift to more collaborative thinking and working, and to opening yourself up to different viewpoints, and how doing so will inevitably lead to more innovative outcomes. So the third point I want to sort of speak to is that people matter. And maybe this is obvious, particularly in this sector, but I think it's worth spending a little bit of time on. So yes, the partnership that we're talking about, the types of partnerships are between organizations, but people and the relationships between those people are the critical glue, and I think sort of enabler of success. Now, partnerships take time and attention. Genuine relationships cannot be fast-tracked, and cannot be transactional. This is a sector that's driven by passion and heart. So again, this may very well be obvious, but I think it's worth reiterating. And I think it's something that other sectors can learn from. I think it's also important not to assume that the will or mission of an organization will win out over the people putting the good ideas and partnerships into motion. So the people across our teams are our most important kind of ambassadors and most valuable resource. And partnership development can be hard. It can be exhausting. So I think as a leader, if you're asking people to be innovative and asking them to sort of stretch and figure out new ways of doing things that haven't been done before, and to put others first. I mean, it's a lot to ask of people. It can be very energizing. But if the people who are at the forefront of partnership development are not engaged or invested, it's just not going to work. I think it's really, staying on sort of the theme of people, it's important to be really invested in the success of your partners, and like authentically so. So I want to talk about someone on my team whose name is Teresa Marques, no relation. But Sabrina leads a program called Canadian Innovation Week, which takes place every May. So it's coming up around the corner between May 16th and 20th this year. And it's an opportunity that the RHF has developed to shine a spotlight on innovative work that's happening all across the country over a concerted period of time by all sectors. So it's a program that's grown year over year as the CIW kind of platform has evolved. So we're constantly thinking about, how can we make sure that what we're offering will be of great value to our partners? How can we be curious and excited about our partners' successes? Now, Sabrina is the face of this program, and her interactions with each and every partner are personal, and just the enthusiasm she brings when she learns about what someone else is doing and how they're growing and how they're innovating. It's just a real inspiration for our team. And it's an approach that I'm trying to take into my day-to-day life, because it's just a happier way to be. I also want to talk very briefly about someone else on my team who I'm learning a lot from, and his name is Bill Mintram. So Bill is our Director of Indigenous and Northern Relations. And Bill and I work closely on many programs, and he has shared with me and helped me learn that partnerships with Indigenous organizations in particular can take a different approach, that relationships really matter and that they take time. The Rideau Hall Foundation is a non-Indigenous led organization, but we're an organization that is very much committed to learning from Indigenous leadership as well as to reconciliation in Canada. Now, I've learned from Bill in particular that partnership development with Indigenous organizations, again, might look different. It might not be linear, but this different worldview, in fact, I think leads to stronger partnerships that are centered and really anchored on relationships. And I think that's a valuable principle that holds for partnership development with Indigenous communities and organizations, as well as with non-Indigenous, in non-Indigenous contexts. The fourth kind of idea that I'd like to share. So people matter, yes. Details also matter. So this is really about kind of figuring out sort of your parameters for decision-making, as well as your accountabilities and timelines, including sort of the sunset period for each partnership that you're developing, and to write them all down. Plan ahead for moments to evaluate how the thing is working, and have those moments be almost cyclical, so that you're not just evaluating things or realizing, hey, it's worth looking at this when things are going south, because it will be much harder to do. So really just taking the time to write down the details, because details do matter, and they can provide that kind of overarching framework that can then allow for the creativity and the flexibility and being sort of agile. Plan for anticipated as well as unanticipated costs. So the turnover of people, expanded sort of project scope, the fact that there's a global pandemic happening, things that you might not have been able to anticipate when you built the initial partnership, and think ahead about financial management. There's a poet named, I can't remember his first name, but Machado is his last name, and I believe he's Portuguese. And it's that there is no path. The path is made by walking. And I think that's really true and resonant when it comes to working in partnership. There are some cases where you have to do it to understand what it's going to be. And that is not very eloquent, but I think that's the sort of gist of what Machado was getting at. So I think related to kind of the details being important, I think it's important not to not assume that a lack of clarity equates being innovative or flexible. If you have a clear framework, it'll ultimately allow you the space to do the good work, since you've cut down on kind of the unknowns and the misunderstandings, which will inevitably come up from the get-go. And so this really comes down to sort of the strength of governance that's in place, and how it can be sort of a critical enabler that can actually help you to act in ways that are nimble, agile, and responsive if you've thought ahead about kind of what that decision-making framework should look like. So in thinking about sort of a relevant example with the Rideau Hall Foundation, I would point to a program that we work in partnership with called the Michener Awards Foundation. So the Michener Awards, again, are a separate organization named in honor of former Governor General Roland Michener. And really they exist to celebrate and shine a light on public service journalism in the country. So very much a strong alignment of values with the work and mission of the Rideau Hall Foundation. And we were very much interested in kind of getting behind the work that they were doing and seeing how we could provide the organization with greater sustainability and greater capacity and infrastructure. So unlike Forum, and Forum became we figured it out and we just merged. It became a more permanent, fixed relationship. With the Michener Awards Foundation, we actually said, okay, well, let's walk before we run. So we set a time frame on our partnership of a 2-year kind of period to, again, test it out, to get to know each other, just to understand sort of how we might work in collaboration. And then there's a built-in moment to take the time, step aside, see how it's going, and then either renew or deepen or change in whatever way we think both make sense. So that felt, it not only felt like the right thing to do, it felt like a great way to kind of minimize risk on all sides, just to give us that sort of set period that was enough of a time frame to meaningfully work together without kind of asking anyone to sort of overcommit to something they weren't necessarily comfortable with. So the last kind of good idea is around trust, and trust kind of mattering most. You will be much more able to move more quickly and to go farther together if there's trust and open communication between partners. So really, I can't really emphasize this enough, but just the importance of investing early in a culture of trust within your partnership. So, how do you do that? Well, you do what you said you're going to do. You act in ways that are honest and open. You have a commitment to transparency. You over communicate, especially on sticky issues. And I think it's also important in this kind of piece to not assume that one partner sort of holds all the cards or all the risk, that what the other partner is thinking or what's driving them or what their experience has been. I'll also say that I think trust goes kind of both ways, and it's really important to sort of recognize that, especially when the power dynamic is a big issue. And I know we're talking about partnerships across the sector, but when you're thinking about power dynamics, even within the charitable and nonprofit sector, issues like funder and recipient and the dynamic between sort of the power dynamic between that type of partnership can emerge. Now, there's historically been sort of an emphasis on the risk being absorbed by the funder in any kind of sort of granting relationship. But recipients of funding are equally taking on risk in accepting funds from any contributor. So they need to trust the funder as they're also kind of hitching their wagon and sort of reputation to the values of that funder. So all to say, I think setting the groundwork with strong channels for communication, having a commitment to transparency and a willingness to be vulnerable and speak clearly to your organizational successes, strengths, and challenges helps to kind of level the playing field and create the foundation of trust, so that when those inevitable kind of bumps in the road do come up, you have already set the stage for grace and for resolution. So we take time at the RHF to talk about partnership a lot. What's working, what isn't working, why, how we can be better partners. And time again, trust is always a hallmark kind of characteristic of partnerships that are working really, really well. So I've talked about the 5. I snuck in a 6th at the outset, which is to be vulnerable. And I'm going to sneak in a 7th very quickly before I turn it back to you, Elizabeth. And it's just to, again, think about the end of the partnership as well. So again, I use the Michener example as sort of one piece that had sort of an explicit timeline horizon. But more deeply than that, I think the example between the Community Foundations of Canada incubating the Rideau Hall Foundation and planning for a very successful end of that relationship made such a huge difference to our ability to maintain a great relationship between the RHF and CFC today, and to just make sure that happened in a way that was really, really smooth. It was sort of a conscious, we consciously uncoupled before it was cool. And I think I became CEO of the Rideau Hall Foundation just at the tail end of that period. And I can see now in retrospect how thoughtfully it was done in a way that really set us up for success. There are other examples that I can speak to maybe over the conversation around partnerships that we had to exit more abruptly. And sometimes those comes sort of with their own, risk elements and are disrupting, but happy to kind of go into more detail on that piece as well. So all to say, we have big challenges that are complex ahead of us around climate, food security, inclusion, shifting geopolitical realities, and widening gaps in access to opportunity. These challenges are going to require complex and new solutions, and they're going to require us to find new ways of collaborating and working together. Problems can only be solved by working together and by changing the nature of how we do so. So I just want to thank you all for the work that you're doing in the sector and for taking the time to learn about some of my thoughts. And I'm really hopeful that we can now surface reactions that you have and to hear from your experience as well. So thank you. And Elizabeth, with that, I'll turn back to you.
Thank you. That was remarkable. I've done a lot of work on collaboration and partnership, and I've never heard it all brought together so thoughtfully and in a really useful and manageable framework. So thank you. And I think you've hit a chord with the audience with your quote from Antonio Machado. So lots of applause for that. We have a number of questions already coming in. I'm going to comment on some of this stuff as we go through. I'll turn to the questions first, and then I'll use my prerogative when I get a chance. Right out of the gate, we have a question. What about a potential partnership, in quotes, with an organization who may be viewed as a competitor in terms of attention, funding, staff resources to advance work in a similar area? And I many years ago, I worked in a project where I think it was Mario Calla from Costi called it co-opetition, and the art and science of doing that. So the question is, any thoughts about how to navigate requests from such a potential partner to work together to ensure mutual value rather than favoring one organization over another?
Yeah, it's a great and very real kind of question. So it kind of relates to one of my, I don't know what, one or two, but just focusing on complementarity as opposed to similarity, just because things can be a bit less fuzzy when you do so. But I think also, I think it's a bit of a misnomer to think that resources in the sector are finite. I think that there is room for all of us. And when you are partnering with an organization, if your primary focus remains like the thing that you're both trying to achieve as a starting point, and then again, building the right framework for partnership around that thing that is your shared interest, it's a great kind of North Star and can be sort of the piece that helps to kind of cut away some of that noise. I think that the greater the trust relationship, the greater the transparency, the greater the communication, the more that you can actually celebrate the successes of your partners as opposed to coming at it from that sort of deficit or competitive mindset. Way easier said than done. I recognize that. But I don't know if Elizabeth, if you have other reactions or thoughts to that question.
I think it's a hugely important question, because I think if the sector is going to deliver on its mission and really, accelerate impact, it's going to take some of those sometimes compromising relationships and partnerships in order to do that, to raise it up. And I think just an extra element is sometimes needing to park the organizational ego. Yeah. And focus on who is the constituency, what are you trying to achieve? And sometimes that refocus can help prioritize, and where's the shared values and where's the shared goal, and I guess really articulating that shared goal and keeping that front and center. And I think that was your very first point. What's important in keeping that front and center. here's a sort of, I guess, another layer to it, but perhaps with a bit more stuff involved. How do you navigate a relationship with multiple partners who have had conflicts with each other in the past? History.
Yeah, what do you do at the Christmas table when all the families kind of coming together, and how do you keep the peace? So yeah, I don't know that there's kind of one answer to that question. Again, I think from our perspective, it's been really helpful for the partnerships that we've engaged in that we can bring sort of a neutrality to the space, and that neutrality can help to kind of encourage people to sort of park the ego a little bit. So really trying to kind of model and emphasize celebrating each other's successes and kind of not being kind of rooted in the past has been sort of a practical way forward from our perspective. But again, these are not easy questions. They don't have necessarily super obvious answers. I think, again, just really open collaboration. I think talking about what didn't go right in the past too is key. Like, I think that if there are kind of wounds that have taken place, or history that is troubling between organizations that you're trying to either bring together or work through, it's really hard to pretend like that didn't happen. So I think it comes down to that sort of starting point at the beginning of kind of partnership development, as you're kind of thinking about what are the table stakes, what didn't work well before, how can we make sure that that doesn't happen again, and being as transparent and kind of frank as possible at that starting point, and then moving forward, if things start to go south, or if problems begin to emerge again, calling those problems, being open about those problems, as opposed to letting them fester, as you would in like any healthy relationship with a family member or a partner. So yeah.
Exactly. And I think that it also taps back into a number of your points that you made. It's people matters, details matter, having that transparency, building the trust. Recently, we were in an early conversation of a partnership with an organization, and the Indigenous lead said, well, let's move at the pace of trust. So I give credit to that concept to Conrad Prince, who's doing the reconciliation project at Save the Children. It's a really profound framing. Like, we'll go as fast as we can, and we need to get the essentials down first. It's a good parameter. A couple practical questions about doing partnership and funding relationships. Doreen asks, first, thank you, Teresa. In one of your examples, you mentioned the importance of having a contingency plan. Would you advocate for including contingency funding in grants?
So it's a great question. I'm not super as well versed, frankly, in kind of best practices related to grant making. So I don't want to kind of speak for those who might be better positioned to do so. Our approach when it comes to the grants that we're getting behind at the Rideau Hall Foundation is to be pretty flexible and just to acknowledge that the organizations that we're supporting are closest to the work, closest to the priorities that need to happen, and need operational funding support that is sustainable. So those are some of the priorities that we try to and the values that we try to put at the forefront of any granting relationship that we develop. And we also try to do so in a way that's collaborative with the person or the organization that we're issuing the funding to. So working with that partner organization to figure out, what is the right sort of spectrum of pieces of the puzzle that need to be worked into this kind of collaboration agreement or this funding agreement. So I don't want to suggest that I'm an expert in that particular space, but again, it's really leading with trust and thinking about our working relationship with those we are issuing grants to, and trying to kind of just stay true to that trust-based sort of philanthropic priority.
Right. A little bit different, but kind of related. Any thoughts on where a small nonprofit could find external help, support, guidance to explore and enter partnerships in a systematic and efficient way?
Yeah, it's a great question. I wish there were more conversations like this happening kind of at scale across the country. So it depends kind of where you are in the country. I think Makeway is doing some really interesting work in terms of providing that sort of a scalable solution and platform for nonprofits. Helping to kind of build capacity and provide some of that back end infrastructure as a nonprofit is kind of working towards more permanent charitable status. There are, I think Imagine Canada is doing some interesting work in this space too. I think, I'd be happy to follow up with anyone on this call or directly for our experiences at the Rideau Hall Foundation and the networks that we've become part of related to, work in innovation, in learning, in giving, in volunteerism, or in, I always forget the last one, leadership. In any one of those spaces, we're happy to kind of connect one-on-one for another conversation about where we might be able to facilitate some introductions, because that there aren't enough broad networks. And I think I'm really committed to the idea that, I recognize that we have this kind of vantage point or perspective on what's happening across the country. And I'd love to be able to help foster some connections for folks on this call as well.
Terrific, thank you. You spoke about risk, and I think there's risk in every relationship, partnership, collaboration. How do you deal with the liability piece when you have a partner? So for example, organization does something that brings negative attention and or financial liability to organization B. So I guess this is a little bit of now things are going sideways or south.
Yeah. So I think you have to, to the extent possible early on, you need to plan for what those risks might be and try to kind of anticipate what might go wrong. And there are broad ranges of risk, from legal to insurance to reputational to financial. So even doing, I think sort of enterprise-wide risk management can be sort of all-encompassing, and it can take up all of your time, but it can also be done sort of simply and more intuitively. And so a practice that we engage with at the Rideau Hall Foundation is to kind of surface on a pretty regular basis. Let's just to take stock of like, how are we thinking about risk across the organization and across our partnerships? And do we need to do anything differently? So we're always just trying to keep sort of a bit of a watchful eye on how things change, because we know things will change over time. So one example that I can speak to really quickly, and I can name names without worrying, I think, is a partnership that we engaged in a couple of years back. I'll try to keep this a short story, with a global program called Pitch at Palace. And it was, we felt like it had all the right things in it. So it was a program that was supporting young entrepreneurs across the country. It was taking place in 60 countries. It was sort of a pitch competition for entrepreneurs that helped connect entrepreneurs across the country to investors and to new opportunities. So it had innovation, it had youth, it had national scale, and it had sort of celebrating excellence in Canada. It wasn't happening in Canada, so we entered into a partnership with the organization that ran Pitch at Palace to actually bring it to Canada. It was a great success. We planned for kind of how we would roll this out in 6 different cities, coast to coast to coast. And we learned a lot about really excellent entrepreneurs, and we were able to connect those entrepreneurs to funders. The reason it fell apart, frankly, and I'm being very just kind of direct here, is that the figurehead of the program, it was founded by Prince Andrew, the Duke of York. And this was circa 2017 or 18 or so, just before everything kind of went south in that way. And so we, when I was thinking through the risks to this program, it was not that there'd be this sort of major reputational piece that was just like a deal breaker for us. So we did, it was difficult because the mechanics of the program were so good and the bones of it were great. And so it felt like a real sort of loss at the end of the day to not be able to continue with it. But you just reach this point where you know that you need to walk away. And that became a clear question. I mean, there was the objective analysis that we had done. And then there was the gut, our values are not syncing up here. And we actually stepped away from the program and sort of cut ties more publicly, which is why I feel comfortable saying it sort of out loud in this intimate room of 157 people.
And being posted later on the website. No, I think that's hugely important, because there are times when it has to be public. There's clear lines that you can't cross, and it's important for your own reputational integrity that you're out in front before it happens. The flip side of it, when you've had a successful partnership, How do you measure it? I mean, we're obsessed with measuring everything. Do you need to measure it? Can you just know that it was successful because X, Y, and Z was accomplished? Or is there a due diligence around measuring the success or failure of the partnership?
Yeah, I think that there is. I think it's always worth taking that time to evaluate, although I totally agree. I mean, sometimes evaluation and measurement can just become, it's like ad nauseum, and you spend all your time evaluating, not your time doing the thing itself. That being said, you know, as much as it's important not to only evaluate when things are kind of going wrong, you want to evaluate when things are going right as well. So I think for all sorts of reasons, it's worth taking the time to kind of build in that opportunity just to take a step back and take stock of what you've done together, and to figure out how you can talk about it publicly. I mean, I think we're all sort of looking for ways to kind of learn from each other. I think it would benefit the broader sector to hear about partnerships that are working effectively. I think often there's a definite sort of funder dynamic to this as well, and sharing the successes of partnership can also be helpful in that regard, in terms of profiling and putting sort of a bit more of a, shining a bit of a spotlight on kind of what's working really well. So I don't know if that answers the question, but yes, I do think it's worth putting in some systemic kind of way or systematizing, that's the better word, way of kind of measuring progress, but without letting it kind of completely bog you down. I also think that, you know, I wanted to work this in and I didn't get a chance to, so I'll say it now. But I think a partnership can be successful even if the thing itself is not successful. So you and your partner organization may design a collaborative model to do a certain thing, and you're innovating and you're trying and you're both putting skin in the game, and you're both putting resources in, and you have best efforts, and you trust each other, and you've tried something new and it doesn't work. That's going to happen sometimes. Like the thing itself, just because the thing itself doesn't happen the way you thought or hoped it would, is not necessarily the measure of whether it was a good partnership or not. So I just think it's really important to think about, you know, assessing the partnership as well as the outcome that you were hoping to achieve together.
Oftentimes the relationship may produce and reinvent itself, and the longer trajectory of that is way beyond the line of sight of any evaluation.
Totally. Yeah.
You know, it could be 10, 15 years down the road, and when you go back to the origin of how did it all start, there's these other things that happened that built really a strong foundation of relationship.
Or you may do something else together down the road, like with that in a different context.
Yeah, but the seeds of it reside there. I think this is an interesting question. What does leadership look like in a collaborative environment? Now, there's all kinds of models of leadership. What are your thoughts on what kinds of leadership models work well?
That's a big question. We could probably spend like a whole next 5 ideas on that question alone. You know, I really think I'll go back to one of the concepts I mentioned earlier, that I think this notion of kind of top-down leadership is really like control and command is super outdated and is not part of the culture of building collaborative partnerships. Like it doesn't, there's not a space for it or a place for it in collaborative partnerships. So, you know, I think as a leader myself, I'm trying to always sort of set the table to, you know, bring forward others' ideas and to try to serve as like, I came into this conversation. I'm not the expert in this area, and so if I can kind of create the space and conversation to lift up others and to give voice to others, I think that's an approach that kind of bodes well in any kind of collaborative partnership approach. Just I really feel strongly that sort of the old power principle around control and command leadership is not the way forward, and it doesn't have a space or role to play in building healthy partnerships. And again, that goes back, that is also replicated like in life.
Well, and it contradicts some of your key ideas around trust, vulnerability, and those kinds of core pieces that lead to strong partnerships. I want to follow up with Doreen's question around contingency funding. Somebody responded to that in the Q&A. So just to share to everyone, this is from Barry Waldman. I've found that most funders are uncomfortable with contingency funding per se, because it provides no assurance of impact. If you can break down the nature of the contingencies, that's easier for their funder to trust. So I think that's a good piece of advice. Thank you, Barry. We have another question. We're an intermediary organization trying to promote multiple organizations to collaborate on a project. Do you have any insights, recommendations on navigating the power imbalance between big and small, ensure that everyone has a voice at the table? So we talked about the power differential in money, but what about size, which is also sometimes money?
I think, yeah, these things are related. I think as an intermediary, you're in a really interesting position, and you have a really great opportunity to sort of level the playing field for the different partners you're working with. So I think the onus will be on you as the intermediary kind of organization to help kind of lift up, make sure that each of the partners that you're either receiving funding from or giving funding to have equal voice at the table. But that, you're sort of the one who's setting the stage for the dance to happen. And so I think you do have a great opportunity and ability to kind of make sure that you're sort of giving space and voice and spotlight to each of those organizations, no matter what their kind of size is. And the fact that you're an intermediary can maybe it positions you in a way that is a bit more neutral in that regard, to be able to sort of set that table appropriately.
And I think that that's a good segue to this other question, which is there a maximum number of partners you can have before it becomes untenable? Too many cooks in the kitchen? And is it really about how you set the table? And back to your very first point, form follows function, and just designing to the complexity of the partnerships.
Yeah, it's such a great question, because I think you can sort of imagine the right number, but then each of the partnerships itself will have its own sort of lifespan and may evolve and may grow and become more complex than you anticipated. So it's both kind of the right number of partners to be working with, and then the right size of the things that those partners are working on, if you will. And it's a really tough, it's a tough balance to get right. I admit to not getting, I don't have that figured out yet, but it's something that we're constantly kind of looking at, because there are so many great initiatives and opportunities that are out there. I mean, I think with our team, we kind of know when it feels like too much, and we try to kind of follow those, follow the instincts of the team in terms of when it's feeling like we're kind of reaching capacity and stretch. And then when we are at that stretch point, we figure out, okay, if we take on more, what needs to change? Does it, is something else winding down, or can we bring on additional capacity? And then sometimes it goes down to sort of where you have to say no, or where you can maybe help to redirect. So saying no, I think, was another one of the resources. A good nose was another one of the resources that I either put on the list or was going to. I can't remember now. But there's a great sort of HBR piece that I found pretty valuable in terms of like smart no's, when you just don't look at the capacity, despite your sort of best interest and your best effort, I'll say, to get involved. So I'm not sure if that was helpful, but
I think it was. I would just sort of add to that. I mean, I think feeling comfortable to step back and say, if we want to do that, we have to change, and being prepared to redesign in process. If we want to go there, then this is what has to be put in place, and it's okay to change track.
Yes, absolutely. It's kind of weird not to change track. In fact, like, given just how partnerships kind of unfold, there are always going to be evolutions that you need to be able to respond to and figure out how you will make decisions together with your partner when those eventual pieces change.
There's one last question, because we're at 1:56, but I think we've got time to slip one more in. This is from Shannon. We are a funding organization. Do you have any suggestions on building relationships when our organization's members, the people, have limited appointment terms? So turnover, how do you manage that?
Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, I think there is sort of an institutional memory that needs to be kind of developed at the organization. And I know it kind of runs counter to what I earlier said around that people are the most important. Like, yes, like these relationships, like Sabrina on our team is absolutely the face and is building these relationships across the country in support of this initiative we have called Canadian Innovation Week. But how do we help ensure that what she is learning and surfacing becomes kind of institutional knowledge and kind of builds the bank of our own kind of corporate memory? So, that's a bit of infrastructure that needs to be built on the inside to make sure that we're not kind of losing the great sort of intelligence and learnings that she's been able to surface.
Yeah. Lots of people putting stuff in the chat as well. So thank you for that. Thank you to everyone who's engaging in different ways. I'm watching 3 different columns to see where stuff is coming in, which means that it's a sign of a great conversation. Thank you, Teresa, for an incredible conversation. I think I'm hearing all kinds of applause in the chat room, but it's been a really helpful and thoughtful set of comments and responses and insights to what's clearly a lot of really great experience in your back pocket. I want to also say thank you to our audience, really engaged, lots of insight, lots of experience. Thank you for being here. Everyone is busy, so we really appreciate the time that you've taken to join us.